Edward Carter sat in his dimly lit office, surrounded by old maps and scattered papers. His eyes were fixed on a faded treasure map, drawn by someone long gone. The lost Dutchman's mine had lured many adventurers, but none had returned. Yet Edward believed it wasn't just a myth. The allure of the treasure, buried in the Arizona desert, was irresistible. His obsession with the mine started years ago, after he stumbled upon a journal describing its curse. Some said it was the work of a vengeful spirit, others believed it was an impossible puzzle. But Edward knew the truth was hidden somewhere. There were secrets buried deep within, and he would uncover them, no matter the cost. But first he needed to find someone who could help him navigate the desert. Clara Williams stood at the doorway of Edward's office, arms crossed. She had always warned him about the dangers of chasing ghosts, but she knew better than to try and stop him. Edward's mind was set, and once it was, nothing could change it. "You're going after it, aren't you?" Clara asked, her voice filled with concern. Edward didn't look up. He was already packing his bag with supplies. "I have to know, Clara," he replied quietly. "Too many have tried and failed, Edward. There's something off about that mine. It's cursed." Clara's words hung in the air, but Edward remained silent, staring at the map. He knew the risks, but he also knew he couldn't let the mystery slip away. Clara watched as Edward prepared for the journey. The more he packed, the less she felt she could stop him. She had tried to dissuade him, but his obsession was too great. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice sharp. Edward glanced up at her briefly. "Maybe, but I can't let it go. I need to find out the truth." Clara shook her head. "What if the truth isn't worth it?" Edward paused. It wasn't an easy question, but he knew his answer. Some truths are worth the risk. As he zipped up his bag and slung it over his shoulder, Clara's worry deepened. She was already planning how she would try to stop him. As Edward slung his bag over his shoulder, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this would be the last time she saw him. She had known him long enough to recognize that once his mind was set, there was no turning back. "Edward, if you go after that treasure, you're not just risking your life. You're risking everything." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the concern she tried to mask. Edward paused for a moment, his hand resting on the door handle. "I can't live with the question of whether it's real or not, Clara. I have to find out, even if it costs me everything." Clara's eyes softened for a moment, but she knew there was no changing his mind. "Be careful," she whispered, but Edward was already walking out, leaving the office in an eerie silence. Edward drove through the desolate desert, his mind consumed with thoughts of the lost Dutchman's mine. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a lonely ribbon of asphalt surrounded by barren land. As the miles passed, Clara's words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't turn back now. The map was in his hands, and the treasure was within reach. He had read about the curse, the countless men who had died seeking the gold, but there was a part of him that believed he could be different. He could solve the puzzle, overcome the curse, and claim the prize. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The vast emptiness of the desert seemed to close in on him, an eerie feeling that something ancient and powerful lurked just beyond sight. The sun began to rise over the Arizona desert, casting long shadows across the endless expanse of sand and rock. Edward Carter, with Clara Williams beside him, drove the jeep across the rugged terrain. The journey to the lost Dutchman's mine was as dangerous as it was unknown. Clara's doubts grew stronger as they moved deeper into the desert. She had warned him, yet here they were, venturing into a place where many had disappeared. Edward, however, was undeterred. "We'll find it," he muttered, more to himself than to Clara. But deep down, he knew the risks, and yet he was determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. Clara looked out at the endless horizon, a feeling of unease gnawing at her. The jeep rattled as it bounced over the uneven desert road. The air was thick with the smell of dry earth and the heat of the midday sun. Edward glanced at Clara, who had remained silent for a while now, lost in her thoughts. "You don't have to come," he said softly, trying to break the silence. Clara met his gaze, her expression hard. "I'm here because I care about you," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with apprehension. "But I still don't think this is a good idea. There's something off about this place." Edward didn't respond immediately, focusing on the road ahead. The tension between them grew, but neither knew how to bridge the gap between their different beliefs about the mine. The desert around them seemed to close in, as if the land itself was watching them. As the day wore on, the landscape grew even more desolate. A thick haze hung in the air, and the temperature soared. The vast expanse of sand dunes stretched endlessly before them. The only sounds were the wind and the distant hum of the jeep's engine. "I think we're close," Edward said, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Clara wasn't convinced. "You said that hours ago," she muttered, glancing at the map once again. But as they moved forward, something in the distance caught Edward's eye, a figure standing alone against the desert backdrop. It was a man dressed in tattered clothes, waving his arms frantically. Without a word, Edward slammed on the brakes. "Who is that?" Clara asked, a chill running down her spine. The figure approached the jeep slowly, his movements jerky and erratic. When he finally reached them, Edward rolled down the window, his hand instinctively hovering near his sidearm. The man looked ragged, his face sunburned and haggard. "You're looking for the mine," the man rasped, his voice rough from thirst. Edward nodded cautiously. "Who are you?" he asked. The man's eyes darted nervously as he spoke. "I was one of the last to try. That place, it changes people." He staggered closer, his hands shaking. "It's cursed, you hear me. No one who goes looking for it comes back the same or at all." Clara's eyes widened as she exchanged a glance with Edward, both unsure of what to make of this stranger's warning. The man's warning hung in the air as the jeep remained stationary. Edward's grip tightened on the steering wheel, while Clara glanced at the stranger nervously. The man's voice grew more frantic as he continued. I tried to leave. But the desert, it gets in your head, it pulls you in. You'll see things, hear things that aren't there. You think you're chasing treasure, but it's the curse that's chasing you." Edward shook his head, trying to keep his focus. "I'm not afraid," he said firmly, though his voice betrayed the slightest hesitation. The man stepped back, muttering to himself. "It's not the treasure that's cursed," he said, almost as if to himself. "It's the mine itself." Edward drove forward, ignoring the man's pleas. Clara could feel the weight of the warning settling in her mind, but it was too late to turn back now. Edward and Clara made their way deeper into the desert, the heat of the sun intensifying with every mile. The man's warning still echoed in Clara's mind, but Edward's resolve was unwavering. They had been on the trail for days now, and they were closing in on the lost Dutchman's mine. As they set up camp one evening, Clara finally voiced the concern that had been eating away at her. "I'm starting to think we made a mistake," she said quietly, staring into the flickering campfire. Edward looked up, his expression grim but determined. "It's too late for second thoughts now, we've come too far," he replied. Clara hesitated. What if the curse is real? What if it's already started to change us? Edward didn't answer, but the unease in his eyes said more than words could. The next day, the desert landscape seemed even more oppressive. The air felt thick, as if the very earth was alive with secrets. Edward and Clara continued their search, but the further they went, the more Clara's discomfort grew. As the sun beat down relentlessly, Edward pulled out the map, tracing their route with his finger. "We're close," he said, his voice more confident than he felt. Clara squinted at the horizon, but all she could see was an endless stretch of sand and rocks. "You're sure?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Edward didn't answer right away. There was something in the air, something strange, that made him question his certainty. But he had come too far. The treasure was within reach, and with it, the answers he had been searching for. As they ventured deeper into the desert, the terrain became more treacherous. Jagged rocks and narrow ravines appeared, forcing them to slow their pace. Clara's anxiety was growing, and she couldn't help but notice how the land seemed to change around them. It wasn't just the terrain that felt different. There was a palpable sense of foreboding in the air. "Edward, do you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward stopped, looking around with a frown. "Feel what?" he asked, scanning the horizon. "The air. It feels thick, like we're not alone out here," she replied. Edward sighed and placed the map in his bag. "There's nothing out here but dust and rock. We're fine." But as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Something unseen, just out of reach. They continued their trek, the silence between them growing. Edward's mind raced with thoughts of the treasure, the answers it could provide. But Clara's words about the curse haunted him. The deeper they went, the more he questioned if they were truly alone. At night, Clara couldn't sleep, hearing strange sounds echoing in the desert's vastness. It was as if the land itself was alive, whispering secrets from the past. "I keep hearing things," Clara confessed the next morning, her voice shaky. "I can't explain it." Edward looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "It's just the desert. You're hearing the wind, that's all," he reassured her. But even as he spoke, his own unease grew. There was something in the distance, something moving on the horizon. But when he blinked, it was gone. The next day, Edward and Clara found a series of strange carvings etched into the rocks, hidden in a narrow canyon. The symbols seemed ancient, perhaps marking the path to the mine. As Edward examined the markings, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something far darker than they had anticipated. "These carvings, they're not just old," she said, pointing to the symbols. "They're warnings." Edward didn't respond immediately, but as he studied the markings he felt an uneasy chill. The air around them seemed to grow colder, even though the sun was still high. Clara's suspicion grew. "We need to turn back," she urged, but Edward was already moving forward, his obsession with the treasure blinding him to the danger around them. As the sun dipped behind the jagged horizon, Edward and Clara stood on the edge of a cliff, gazing down at a strange abandoned structure in the valley below. It looked like a long-lost outpost, overrun with creeping vines. The sense of foreboding that had plagued Clara for days intensified. This doesn't feel right," she murmured, gripping the edge of the cliff with both hands. Edward, however, was undeterred. "This is it. I can feel it," he said, his voice calm but determined. The excitement in his eyes was undeniable, but Clara's unease was palpable. The deeper they ventured, the more she wondered if they were walking into a trap. "We're too close to turn back now," Edward added, already starting down the rocky path toward the structure. Clara hesitated but followed, unsure of what they would find but knowing it was too late to stop. They made their way down the cliffside, each step careful and measured. As they neared the structure, the air grew thick, heavy with the weight of something ancient. The walls of the building were carved with strange symbols, similar to the ones they had seen in the desert. Clara shuddered. "This place, it's not just a ruin," she whispered. Edward, eyes scanning every detail, couldn't shake the sense that they were being drawn into something far older and more dangerous than they had anticipated. "I don't think this is a mine," he said quietly, realizing that what they had found might not be treasure, but something far darker. As they approached the entrance, a low growl echoed through the air, sending a chill down their spines. They turned toward the sound, but nothing was visible, only the ever-encroaching darkness. As they entered the building, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door behind them, making Clara jump. The interior was cold and damp, the walls lined with old wooden beams and crumbling stone. Strange, unidentifiable artifacts lay scattered across the floor, giving the room an unsettling, otherworldly feel. "What is all of this?" Clara whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Edward, drawn toward a pedestal in the center of the room, didn't answer. He was too focused. On the pedestal rested an ornate box, covered in symbols matching those outside. His heart raced. This was it. The treasure. But as his fingers brushed the box, the ground beneath them trembled slightly. The faint sound of a low rumble seemed to rise from deep below. Clara grabbed his arm. "Edward, we need to leave," she urged. But Edward couldn't move. The pull of the box was stronger than his fear. As the tremors intensified, the walls seemed to groan, and the air grew colder. Clara grabbed Edward's arm, pulling him away from the pedestal. "We need to go now," she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. But Edward was still fixated on the box, his hand trembling as he reached for it. Suddenly, the box opened by itself, revealing a glowing ancient artifact inside, a crystal that pulsed with a strange, otherworldly light. The moment the crystal was exposed, the entire building shook violently, sending dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. Edward stumbled back, the shock of the moment snapping him out of his trance. Clara's scream echoed through the building as the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. "We've unleashed something we can't control," Clara said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave, before it's too late." The entire building seemed to be alive, reacting to the presence of the artifact. The low rumbling turned into a violent shaking, and the floor cracked beneath them. Edward and Clara stumbled toward the exit, but the door was jammed shut. "We trapped," Clara shouted, pounding on the door. Edward, panicking now, pushed with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The crystal's light grew brighter, almost blinding, as if the building itself was being consumed by the power within. Clara's voice trembled as she yelled at Edward, "We have to destroy it." But Edward couldn't bring himself to do it. His obsession had clouded his judgment, and now it was too late. The structure groaned, and the ground cracked further, threatening to swallow them whole. In that moment, Edward realized they had unleashed something far more dangerous than gold. The building continued to tremble as Edward and Clara tried to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the walls creaked and groaned, a horrifying reminder of the power they had unleashed. "We need to get out," Clara screamed, pulling at the door. Edward was still staring at the glowing crystal, his eyes wide with awe and fear. "Edward, this is not what we came for. The treasure isn't worth it," Clara cried, her voice breaking. Edward turned to her, his expression conflicted. "I have to know what it is, Clara. I can't leave without knowing." As the tremors intensified, the walls cracked further, and the floor began to crumble beneath them. The ground opened up, and Clara grabbed Edward's arm, pulling him away from the pedestal. "We're out of time," she shouted, but Edward's obsession had already clouded his judgment. "I won't leave until I understand." Clara's grip tightened on Edward's arm, her heart pounding. "Edward, listen to me," she pleaded. "We're both going to die if you don't get us out of here." But Edward, consumed by the glow of the artifact, pushed her away. "I can't leave now, Clara. The answers are here. You don't understand what this means." He stepped toward the pedestal again, ignoring Clara's frantic cries. As he reached for the crystal once more, the building shook violently, and the floor beneath them split wider, creating a jagged hole. Clara fell to her knees, her voice trembling. "Please, Edward, we have to go." But Edward was already too far gone, the power of the artifact drawing him in. A new, darker energy filled the room, one that neither of them could escape. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the darkness. It was low and guttural, almost like a whisper from the earth itself. "You shouldn't have come." Clara froze, her blood running cold. Edward turned, his eyes still locked on the crystal. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling but determined. The voice spoke again, this time closer. "You awakened the curse. The price must be paid." Edward's face hardened. "I don't believe in curses," he spat, but his voice wavered. Clara looked around frantically, her eyes searching for the source of the voice. "Edward, we need to go now," she screamed. But as the ground cracked further and the air grew colder, Clara realized they were no longer alone. Something was waiting for them. The ground continued to shake, and the rumbling beneath their feet intensified. "It's too late," the voice boomed, this time more forceful, as if the entire structure was speaking. "You have awakened what should have remained hidden." Clara grabbed Edward's arm, pulling him away from the pedestal with all her strength. "We're going to die if we don't leave," she screamed. But Edward, his eyes wide with obsession, shook her off. "I have to know. I need to understand." He stepped forward again, ignoring the cracks in the floor, and reached for the glowing crystal. In that instant, the entire room collapsed, and a massive force hurled them both backward. The darkness closed in around them as everything went black. When Edward and Clara regained consciousness, they found themselves outside the collapsed building, lying in the dirt. The desert air was thick with dust, and the sky above was dark with the promise of a coming storm. Clara looked over at Edward, who was still staring at the horizon, his expression empty. "We're alive," Clara whispered, relief flooding her. But Edward's silence was unnerving. "We should have never come," Clara muttered, tears welling in her eyes. Edward finally turned to her, his voice low. "We didn't leave empty-handed." He pulled out the glowing crystal from his bag. Clara's eyes widened with horror as she realized the true cost of their journey. They had both been changed, by the curse, and by the treasure. The desert was silent, broken only by the sound of the wind brushing over the sand. Edward and Clara, exhausted and desperate, continued their trek through the barren landscape, the weight of their failure heavy on their shoulders. They had escaped the collapsing building, but the truth of what they had unleashed was now evident. The crystal's eerie glow still pulsed faintly in Edward's bag, a constant reminder of the curse that followed them. Clara's voice broke the silence. "We should have left it behind," she whispered. Edward, his face grim, glanced at her. "It's too late for that. We can't undo what's been done." Clara's heart sank, the magnitude of their mistake finally hitting her. "So what now? We just keep running?" Edward didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly before them, but the answers they sought were no longer in the landscape. They were buried deep within. As they trudged on, Clara's mind raced with the events that had unfolded. The crystal had altered something deep within them, and now she could feel its pull growing stronger. "Edward," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't think it's done with us yet." Edward's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Clara shook her head, looking at him with fear in her eyes. "I don't know, but it's like it's calling to us. It's not just a treasure. It's something darker." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. He had ignored the warning signs, convinced that the treasure would bring answers. But now he realized that the curse had been guiding them all along, manipulating their every move. "We need to find out what this is really about," he said. But even as he spoke, the weight of the crystal's influence grew heavier, as if it had already begun to take root inside them. They reached an old dilapidated shack on the outskirts of a dying oasis. It was the only structure they had encountered for miles. The walls were cracked, and the roof was half collapsed, but it provided shelter from the relentless desert sun. Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with dust and the scent of decay. Edward dropped his bag to the floor, the crystal still pulsing ominously inside. Clara sat down on a broken chair, her face pale. "This is where it all started, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Edward didn't answer immediately. The silence between them was thick, like the desert outside. "We need to figure out who built this," Edward finally said. "There has to be a reason they left it here, a reason the curse was sealed away." Clara looked at him, her expression conflicted. "And what if some things are better left forgotten?" she asked quietly, but Edward was already reaching for his map, ignoring her words. As Edward examined the walls of the shack, he discovered more carvings, symbols identical to those they had found near the mine. But this time, the markings were different, more intricate and detailed. "This is it," Edward said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it all began." Clara approached him, her face drawn with anxiety. "What does it mean?" she asked, looking at the symbols with growing dread. Edward traced one of the markings with his finger. "These are warnings, but also a map to the source of the curse." Clara felt a cold shiver run through her. "You're saying this is the way to end it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward didn't answer. He only stared at the symbols, piecing together the puzzle. But deep down, he knew that whatever lay ahead would be more dangerous than anything they had encountered so far. Edward and Clara stood in front of the shack, the weight of the discovery settling over them. The desert was eerily still. the sun low in the sky as they prepared to follow the map's directions. "If we're going to end this," Clara said, "we need to be ready for whatever comes next." Edward nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "We don't have much time." As they made their way into the wilderness, the pulse of the crystal grew louder in Edward's bag, its influence undeniable. Clara glanced at Edward, her thoughts clouded with doubt, but she knew they had no choice now. They had already crossed the point of no return. The journey ahead would lead them into the heart of the curse, and only one thing was certain: they would not come back the same. Edward and Clara stood at the edge of a deep ravine, the lost Dutchman's mine just beyond the treacherous landscape that lay before them. The air was thick with anticipation, and Clara could feel the weight of the curse closing in around them. "This is it," Edward said, his voice unwavering, though his eyes betrayed the turmoil within. The crystal, now fully glowing, pulsed in his bag, its power beckoning them closer. Clara's heart raced as she glanced down at the abyss between them and the mine. "Do you really think we can stop it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward turned to her, his expression hardened. "We have no choice." The final stretch of their journey was upon them, and they both knew that the truth, whatever it may be, awaited them in the depths of the mine. The question was, would they survive to uncover it? As they made their way down into the ravine, the ground shifted beneath their feet, and the eerie pulse of the crystal grew stronger. The mine was close now, but so was the danger. Clara could feel the change in the air, as if the land itself was reacting to their presence. "It feels like we're walking into a trap," she said, her voice laced with fear. Edward didn't look back. "It's the only way forward." The shadows around them seemed to stretch and flicker unnaturally as they continued downward. Every step felt like it was pulling them deeper into the heart of the curse, yet there was no turning back. The mine was waiting for them, and with it, the answers they both sought and feared. They reached the entrance to the mine, a dark, gaping hole in the rock. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the air smelled stale and damp. Edward paused, staring into the blackness ahead. "This is where it all ends," he said, his voice distant, as if he were speaking to himself. Clara stood beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What if we can't stop it?" she asked quietly. Edward turned to her, his expression grim. "We have no choice," he repeated. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of a low rumble deep within the earth. The mine seemed alive, as though it were waiting for them. With a deep breath, Edward stepped forward into the darkness, Clara following close behind. Inside the mine, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of decay. Edward's footsteps echoed in the stillness, while Clara's breaths came in shallow gasps, the oppressive atmosphere weighing on her. They followed the narrow tunnel, the walls lined with strange markings, some familiar from their journey. Edward stopped at one of the carvings, tracing it with his fingers. "This is it," he murmured, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and dread. "The source of the curse." Clara looked around, her eyes darting nervously. "It's too quiet," she said, the words barely escaping her lips. Just then, a low growl reverberated through the tunnel, and the ground shook beneath them. Clara gasped, her heart racing. "Edward, we need to go now." But Edward stood motionless, staring at the carvings, transfixed. "We've come too far," he said, his voice filled with finality. Curse was here, and so was the truth. As the growl grew louder, the walls of the mine seemed to close in around them. Edward turned to face Clara, his face set with grim determination. "We're going to end this," he said, his voice resolute. Clara's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded, knowing that there was no turning back. The crystal pulsed in Edward's bag, its energy overwhelming. "We destroy it now," Edward said, his hand reaching for the bag. But as he moved closer to the crystal, the growling intensified, and the ground beneath them cracked open. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and shadowy, its form distorted by the light. It was the Keeper of Secrets, the one who had orchestrated their journey all along. "You cannot destroy what has already been awakened," it intoned, its voice echoing in the tunnel. Edward's hand clenched into a fist. We'll see about that.